In 1986, Tom Hawks was a 39-year-old father of two teenage boys. He had previously been married to his boys' mother, but they had ultimately gotten a divorce. That year, Tom and his two sons were at this local chili cook-off in their neighborhood in Newport Beach, California, when Tom was looking out across the sea of people and he sees this stunningly beautiful woman he's never seen before, and he just finds himself staring at her. And he stares at her so long that this woman, she ends up noticing, and she looks up and kind of smiles and blushes and looks away. And Tom immediately is totally embarrassed because he just got caught staring at her. And so he decides, you know what, I got to go over there and introduce myself. And so Tom, who's this totally ruggedly handsome, muscular guy with this incredible mustache, he strides across the lawn and he walks up to this woman and he introduces himself. And she is all smiles and she says her name is Jackie and she's 29 years old and she's single. And from that point onward, those two completely hit it off. They fell madly in love. And just a few years later, in 1989, they got married in front of 150 of their closest friends and family. And then after the wedding, Jackie moved in with Tom and his two boys. And even though the boys' mother was still alive, they began calling Jackie Mom, because Jackie not only lived with them, but also because she was so devoted to them, and she just was such a loving and kind person that it just made sense to do that. Also, Jackie, when she was 22 years old, she had gotten into this horrific motorcycle accident, and the internal damage that accident had done to her had left her unable to have kids of her own, something she had always wanted to do. And so when she had the opportunity to be these boys' mother, she really leaned into it. And so she was like this fabulous mother. So over the years, Tom and Jackie raised their two sons, and then in 2002, when the boys were all grown up, they left the house. Now, this was a sad moment for Tom and Jackie to suddenly be empty nesters. I mean, so much of their identity was wrapped up in being parents, and they were very close with their sons. But at the same time, they knew this day was coming, and they had actually been preparing for it for several years. They had been putting money aside every single year to prepare for when their sons left, because they wanted to time it so they could retire at the same time. And their idea of retirement was to go buy a yacht and just live on the yacht and sail up and down the California and Mexican coastline. Now, neither Jackie nor Tom were wealthy at all. However, they were very good at saving money and they were very disciplined and they could live frugally. And so over the past couple of years, they really had saved virtually every penny so they could afford to buy this yacht. And so finally in 2002, when their sons do actually leave, Tom and Jackie, they sell their house in Newport Beach, California. And between the proceeds from the sale of their house and all this money they had set aside, they had enough to purchase this kind of beat up old small yacht. And so this yacht they named the Well-Deserved. Even though this yacht was by no means a glamorous yacht like you think of when you hear that word, Tom and Jackie adored this boat. And so as soon as it was theirs and they had docked it in Newport, they moved all of their belongings onto this boat because they're going to live on this boat. And then they began meticulously cleaning it and organizing it and upgrading it everywhere they could within their limited budget. And by the summer of that year, this boat was beautiful, both on the outside and the inside. It was very cozy and very clearly had the touch of Tom and Jackie. It was a home. And so for the next 2 years, Tom and Jackie, they lived the dream. They took that yacht and just sailed up and down the coast of California and Mexico, and they would watch these beautiful sunsets, and they would catch fresh fish, and they would drink cocktails together. I mean, they were really enjoying their retirement. Then, in 2004, they got some unexpected news. One of their sons told them that he was now expecting to be a father. And so this baby was going to be the first grandchild of Tom and Jackie, and they were so excited. Especially Jackie, because remember, she wasn't able to have kids of her own, and she just loved the idea of getting to be motherly again, and the idea of getting to hold this precious little baby. And so even though Tom and Jackie were absolutely loving living out on this yacht, they decided that the time was right to actually sell the yacht and then take the proceeds from the sale of the yacht and buy a house on land to be closer to their son and this grandbaby. So in November of that year, the Hawks place an ad in this fishing magazine for the sale of their yacht. They were asking for about $500,000. And very quickly after this ad went live, this young couple who had saved up some cash, they offered to buy it. Tom and Jackie were totally thrilled and they called their two sons to tell them the good news that they had this buyer and that in the next couple of days, the sale would be finalized and then they would be in touch. And so the sons, they're expecting to get a phone call from Tom and Jackie any day, but a couple of days goes by and they haven't heard from them. And so the sons begin calling their parents and their parents aren't picking up their phone. Now, Tom and Jackie were not the type to go any amount of time without being in touch with their family. And so this was very uncharacteristic. And so when Tom's brother, Jim, who was a retired police chief, when he heard about this sudden silence, he just got in his car and drove to Newport Beach, California to see if maybe they had not finalized the sale of the yacht and maybe the couple was still on the yacht and he could go check in with them and make sure everything was okay. And so Jim, along with a friend of his, they arrive in Newport Beach, they make their way to the dock where the yacht was being held, and they go down to the floating section of the dock and they walk right up alongside the well-deserved, and just from where they're standing, it does not seem like anyone is on the yacht. However, as they're standing there just kind of looking at this yacht right in front of them, Jim notices a couple of oddities. He sees there are lines hanging over the side of the boat that should have been stowed. And Tom was known for being incredibly meticulous and orderly. I mean, that yacht was spick and span always. And so he would not have left these lines draped over the edge of the boat unless he was on board, and he wasn't. And so Jim's also looking around and he sees there are a couple of tarps that go over some of the control panels that had been taken off, but then not put back on the control panels. And so again, that's not something Tom or Jackie would have done. And then there's also some dirty towels kind of hanging out of one of the portholes. And so overall, the impression Jim and this friend got was, I guess they must have finalized the sale of this yacht, because clearly the new owners of this boat, they're the ones that are in possession of it, and they're the reason it's sloppy, because Tom and Jackie, they never would leave the boat in this condition. And so Jim pulls out his own business card and he writes a note on it that he's looking to speak with the new owners of this boat because his brother and his brother's wife had sold this boat to them, but now they're missing. And so please give me a call back. And so Jim and his friend, they leave the boat, they leave the dock, and they begin to leave the area when Jim's cell phone rings. And he picks it up, and it's this 21-year-old woman named Jennifer De Leon. And so she tells Jim that she got his business card on her yacht, and that yes, she and her husband had recently purchased this yacht from the Hawks, but like Jim, they were having a hard time getting in touch with the Hawks as well, because after acquiring their boat, Jennifer said she and her husband realized there were a couple of controls on the boat that they didn't know how to use, and so they needed to talk to Tom and Jackie to explain how to use them. Also, Jennifer said she had found some personal belongings that belonged to Tom and Jackie that were stuffed in a couple of drawers that just got left behind, and so she wanted to return that property to them as well. But she's telling Jim, I'm trying to get in touch with them and I can't get in touch with them. And so Jim asked Jennifer, when was the last time you or your husband saw Tom or Jackie? And she would say, the last time we saw them was when we actually finalized the sale of the boat, when we literally gave them the money and we watched them take the money, hop in their car, and drive away. Jim asked her if she had any idea where they might have been going. And Jennifer said, we really didn't have that many personal conversations with Tom or Jackie. It was mostly just business stuff. But in the limited personal interactions we did have, Tom would always talk about how he and Jackie planned on buying a house in Mexico in this town that bordered Arizona, because apparently they have a son that lives in Arizona and he's about to have a baby, and they were talking about how they wanted to be very close. Jim thanked Jennifer and asked her, if you hear from Tom or Jackie, please let me know. And then Jennifer says to Jim, same thing to you. If you hear from them, please let me know, because I need to talk to them too. And so they hang up, and Jim is left thinking, what's going on here? And then Jim remembers there's this woman that Tom and Jackie had hired. Her name was Patricia. And for the past couple of years that they had been out on their boat, they knew they would not have great internet. And so they would not be able to consistently be able to pay their bills and pay taxes. And so they had hired this woman, Patricia, who was also a friend of theirs, to basically pay their bills and manage their finances. And so Jim gets her number and he calls Patricia. And the first thing he asks her is, hey, have you spoken with Tom or Jackie recently? And she says, no, I haven't. And so Jim explains the situation and then asks Patricia, has Tom or Jackie recently made a large deposit into any of their accounts? Because just a couple of days ago, they would have received nearly $500,000. And so Patricia, she checks the accounts and she says, no, there's been no deposits made. And so Jim and Patricia are talking on the phone, trying to rationalize why Tom and Jackie would not have deposited so much money and they really couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation for it. And so after Jim hung up with Patricia, he just had a bad feeling about what was going on. And so Jim called the Newport Beach Police Department, and he officially reported Tom and Jackie missing. The first thing the Newport Beach Police Department did with this missing person report was to do some digging on the new buyers of this yacht, the De Leons. And when they looked at the 25-year-old husband named Skyler, they discovered he was a felon. He had been arrested and convicted of armed robbery and had spent some time in jail for it. And so naturally, the police were immediately suspicious of Skyler De Leon, and really the De Leons in general, because they were the last ones to see the Hawks before they went missing. And so they sent one of their detectives down to the dock to just kind of walk around the yacht and just kind of feel it out, see what's going on down there, see if there's anything unusual. And so this detective goes down to the dock, they walk onto the floating section of the dock, and they walk right up alongside the well-deserved. And from the looks of it, it doesn't appear that anybody's on board. And as this detective is kind of looking in the window and just kind of looking around, they think they see what looks like a bloody handprint inside the boat. And so that would end up being enough to get a search warrant. And before long that day, there were police swarming this boat, looking all over it. But it would turn out that was not a bloody handprint. It was actually just some rust. And there was nothing else of significance that was found on board this boat. And so the police are pretty frustrated because they really don't have any leads. And so they contact Skyler De Leon and they say, hey, you need to come into the police station and explain exactly what happened during your final interaction with the Hawks. And so Skyler comes to the police station, he's totally cooperative, and he explains to the detectives that, he saw this ad in this fishing magazine for a yacht. He contacted Tom Hawk and said, I'm interested. The two of them met up and then went out for a sea trial, which is basically a test drive, but for a boat. And during the sea trial, Skyler told Tom that he liked the boat and he wanted to go forward with the purchase. And so on November 15th, Skyler, along with his pregnant wife and his young daughter, and also a notary and another person, a friend of Skyler's that was there just kind of as a witness, they go to the parking lot of the dock right near where the yacht is. And then the Hawks show up, Tom and Jackie, and the De Leons literally hand over a suitcase full of cash to Tom, and then Tom and Jackie, with the notary, they signed the sale documentation, basically giving the boat over to the De Leons, and then Tom and Jackie took their suitcase full of cash, hopped in their SUV, and they drove off, presumably to go to Mexico. When the police asked Skyler, how were you able to afford such an expensive vessel, Skyler would tell them that back in the 1990s, he was actually a child star, or kind of. He was an extra on the very popular TV show Power Rangers, and from being on that show, he had made a bunch of money and he had set it aside. And as Skyler is telling the detectives this, he kind of just stops himself at some point and he's like, you know what? That's not really the truth. The reality is the reason we had the money to do this is not because of the cash I got from being a child star. It's actually because I stole the money. It would turn out that armed robbery that Skyler was convicted for and spent some time in jail for, that was because he was stealing money from this drug kingpin. And before he was arrested and sent off to jail, he had managed to take the money that he had stolen and hide it. And then after he had gone to jail and got out again, he came back to his hiding space and he just retrieved the money. But this money was stolen drug money, so it was hot. And so he needed to get rid of it. He needed to launder the money. And so that was why he was buying this yacht. He was going to buy it with this dirty money in bulk, in cash, and basically transform this hot, dirty money into this yacht. And then he was going to sell the yacht and get clean money for it. And so the police are totally shocked at this confession because Skyler has just completely incriminated himself in a money laundering scheme. But the police would ultimately say to Skyler, you know what, we're not going to charge you with money laundering because you're being so forthright and helpful with this investigation. And so they let Skyler go. The police would go on to interview Skyler's wife, Jennifer, as well as the notary and also that other friend who had come along for that final sale of the boat who was there as a witness. And so the police interview all three of those people and they asked them, what was your final interaction with Tom and Jackie like? And they all described the same situation of seeing Tom and Jackie taking the suitcase full of cash and then signing the paperwork, hopping in their car and driving off. The only detail that seemed to differ amongst these four people who were there was the way Tom and Jackie were acting. Skylar made it seem like Tom was kind of anxious and paranoid about having all this money, whereas the notary said, Tom and Jackie seemed completely normal to me. After all the interviews with these people who had seen Tom and Jackie last, the police felt like they had kind of reached a dead end and just didn't know what to do next. And so they went to the media and asked them to put out a bulletin that had a picture of Tom and Jackie, as well as a picture of their vehicle, and it asked people to come forward if they had seen them. And sure enough, within a couple of days of this bulletin going out on TV, this older couple in Mexico called the police to say the Hawks SUV is right across the street from me right now. It's parked right on the road. And so naturally, the Mexican authorities as well as American authorities, they rush to this location and they charge up to the house where this SUV is parked, and they're kind of expecting to find Jackie and Tom inside, or someone that at least knows Tom and Jackie. But when they knock on the door, this guy nobody recognized, someone who was living in Mexico, he comes up to the door and he's looking very confused, and the police ask him, whose SUV is that parked outside? And he said, oh, well, that's my friend's car. And they say, well, is your friend Tom or Jackie Hawks? And the guy's like, no, who's that? The car belongs to Skylar De Leon. This was, of course, the moment when the police realized Skylar was lying to them. He had told police the last time he had seen Jackie and Tom, they had hopped in their SUV and they had driven off. But clearly that was not the last time, because he somehow managed to acquire their car afterwards, and then he gave it to this random person in Mexico. So the police in Newport Beach, they used Skylar's money laundering confession on camera to bring him in. They arrested him on money laundering, and then with him in custody, they searched his home. And inside of his and Jennifer's house, they found all these things that belonged to the Hawks. Things like laptops and video cameras, things Tom and Jackie would not have left behind on the boat. But despite all this evidence connecting Skylar De Leon to the Hawks' disappearance, he maintained his innocence and said this was just a big misunderstanding. And then while he was in custody getting grilled by police, his wife, Jennifer, was also saying the same thing, that Skylar didn't do anything. She was even going on talk shows and talking about how this is just one big misunderstanding and Skylar had nothing to do with the Hawks' disappearance, that they are just as concerned about Tom and Jackie as everybody else is. But the police were not buying it. They knew Skylar knew something that he wasn't telling them, obviously. However, they weren't really getting anywhere interviewing Skylar. He was just kind of saying, look, I had nothing to do with it. And so the police decide, let's go back and re-interview the notary and also that other friend who was there as a witness on that day that the final sale of the boat took place. And so they call the notary back into the police department, and the notary is this woman named Kathleen Harris, who's never gotten in trouble in her life, and she's been a very successful notary for a long time. And so she sits down and they ask her again to describe her final interactions with Tom and Jackie. And once again, she says, yep, they came over, they signed the paperwork, they took their cash, they got in their SUV, and they drove off. But under follow-on, very intensive questioning by the police, Kathleen would finally break. And she would say, actually, I've never met Tom and Jackie in my entire life. I was paid up front in cash by Skylar De Leon to backdate those sale documents that had already been signed. I have no idea what happened to Tom and Jackie. Next, the police went out and got that friend who was also there at the time of the final sale, that witness. His name was Alonzo Mason. And so they bring him in and they ask him, what was your final interaction like with Tom and Jackie? And at first he stuck to the story that, they got the cash, they hopped in the SUV, they drove off, that's all it was. And the police stop him and they're like, we just spoke to the notary and she said she was lying. She wasn't even there. She had backdated those documents. So we know you're lying. And so as soon as Alonzo got caught red-handed, he began to clam up. It was pretty obvious he did not want to say anything else. And since the police really needed something to happen with this case, they said to Alonzo, we will make sure your sentence is heavily reduced if you tell us everything you know about what happened to Tom and Jackie. And so Alonzo says, okay, I'll tell you. Alonzo was a young guy, very impressionable. He was in his early to mid 20s, and he was actually a jailer, and he had met Skylar when Skylar was in jail. He was in jail for that armed robbery. And so after Skylar gets out of jail, Alonzo and Skylar somehow stay friends, and they spend a lot of time together. And then in November of 2004, Skylar pulls Alonzo aside, and he confesses to him that he is in fact an international assassin, that people paid him to kill people, but only bad people, Skylar said. And he says to Alonzo, I have a current contract on two really bad people, Tom and Jackie Hawks, but I need help carrying this out. And so if you will help me carry out this contract, I will give you $1 million US. And so Alonzo's like, man, okay, yeah, I'll help you. And so on November 15th, Skylar, Alonzo, and a third man that Skylar had recruited to be a part of this job. He was this big, muscular, intimidating looking guy who was actually a longtime Southern California gang member. His name was John Kennedy. Those three, they show up at the parking lot of the dock not to finalize the sale of this yacht. They weren't even close to finalizing the sale. They were there to meet up with Tom and Jackie to do a sea trial, a test drive. But when Tom and Jackie arrive, Tom, who was a longtime probation officer and so was very used to being around felons and convicts, he immediately sized these three up and thought, bad news. And so when the two parties met each other in the parking lot, Skylar started to notice that Tom was definitely apprehensive about getting on a boat with them. In fact, Tom was talking about potentially rescheduling and that, today's not a good day. And Skylar's seeing, okay, they're clearly uneasy about getting on the boat with us. And so Skylar says, hey, Tom, Jackie, hold on a minute. I'm going to step aside and make a phone call. And so Skylar steps aside and he calls his wife, Jennifer, and she was not far away. And so just a couple of minutes later, Jennifer pulls into the parking lot carrying her little 1-year-old baby girl. And as soon as she walks over to this group, the dynamic completely changes. Jackie sees this baby and she immediately falls in love with it and she wants to hold the baby and she loves Jennifer. Jennifer's so sweet. And so Jackie seems very much at ease and Tom notices that. And so Tom begins to loosen up, and before long, Tom is saying to Skylar, you know what, guys? Today's fine. Let's do the sea trial. And so the group eventually begins to make their way onto the yacht, the well-deserved, to do the sea trial. And right as they're about to get on, Jennifer says, hey guys, I can't go on the sea trial. The baby's upset. I got to go home. I'll see you guys when you get back. And at this point, Tom and Jackie, they've already committed to doing the sea trial. And so even if they were a little bit apprehensive going on this boat with just these three guys, they put their faith in the De Leons that this was on the up and up. So the two Hawks, along with these three men, they get on board the boat and they begin heading out towards open water. And so Tom was piloting the boat. And at some point when they were very far away from the dock and really any land in any direction, Skylar and John come up to Tom and they say, hey, we want to show you something down in the lower levels of the ship. And so Tom goes with them. They go downstairs into the bedroom. And while they're down there, Alonzo and Jackie were in the kitchen, which is right above the bedroom. And as they're standing there, Alonzo and Jackie suddenly hear this very loud commotion coming from the bedroom. Now, Alonzo knew what that was. It was Skylar and John attacking Tom. And so that was his cue. Alonzo leapt forward and he grabbed onto Jackie. And before Jackie could even figure out what was going on, he had thrown her to the ground, pulled her hands behind her back, and then he pulled out handcuffs that he had and he handcuffed her hands together.
Sounds like Jackie's here, Alonzo's here, and then that's where Thomas Hawks, Skylar, and JFK are on the bottom. And Jackie hears the commotion. She looks down this way, and this is where Alonzo overpowers her.
And as soon as Jackie was subdued in the kitchen, Skylar and John, they come up the stairs, and Tom's not with them, and they grab Jackie, and they walk her down into the bedroom, and Jackie would have seen her husband, Tom. He's been handcuffed, and he's laying on the bed on his back. And so they throw Jackie onto the bed right next to Tom, and immediately Jackie turns around and looks at Skylar and says, why are you doing this to us? We just met your wife. I just held your baby. Why are you doing this? All we want to do is just go back to land and be with our children and be with our grandchildren, please. But Skylar didn't care. He just turned to Alonzo and said, put tape on both of their mouths and their eyes. And as Alonzo was doing that, Skylar went upstairs and began piloting the boat towards the deepest part of the ocean. And so as Skylar is driving this boat, Alonzo and John are down in the bedroom, and Alonzo remembers looking over at Tom, and Tom was comforting Jackie. He had managed to pull his hand up and he was stroking Jackie's hand, and he was saying to her, "It's going to be okay. No matter what happens to us, we'll be together." Suddenly, the boat stopped because Skylar had reached the deepest part of the ocean, and he called down to John and Alonzo to bring Jackie and Tom up onto the deck. And so Alonzo and John do just that. They march Tom and Jackie up the steps, they bring them out to the deck of the ship, and then Skylar forces them to sign the sale documentation for the boat, as well as had them sign additional paperwork that gave Skylar access to their bank accounts. And while they were signing these documents, Jackie actually misspelled her last name on one of the signature blocks. She left the S off of her last name. That's not something she would have done by accident. It's pretty clear she did that on purpose to signal to the future that she signed this under duress. After all these documents were signed, the three men led their two captives to the back of the boat. And then once they were standing at the back of the boat, Skylar tells Alonzo, in earshot of Jackie and Tom, to, hey, go to the front of the boat and get the anchor. And so Tom and Jackie, they know that whatever's going to happen to them next, it's not good. And so Jackie begins pleading with them to let them live, let them go back to land, let them see their grandchild. And Tom manages to shake his restraints from John, who was holding him, and he manages to kick Skylar really hard in the groin. But after that, John leapt on top of Tom and Jackie and subdued both of them. And then he positioned Tom and Jackie so they were sitting down back to back with their handcuffs connected to each other. And then Alonzo shows up dragging this heavy anchor, and he finally gets it all the way over until it's right next to Tom and Jackie, at which point Skylar grabs the long metal chain that came off of the anchor, and he felt around until he got to the very end of the chain. So not the side closest to the anchor that's attached to it, the far other side, the bitter end of this chain. And he reached down and he connected that portion of the chain to Tom and Jackie's handcuffs. And then once he was sure their handcuffs were securely fastened to the end of this chain, Skylar stood up, walked over and grabbed the anchor, and with quite a bit of effort, he managed to lift it up and threw it over the side of the boat. As soon as that anchor hit the water, all Tom and Jackie would have heard for several seconds would be the sound of all of that loose chain that they were connected to being rapidly pulled off the boat and being sucked down into the water. And so that chain was going up and over this wooden railing, and so all they would have heard is just chain links grinding over the railing until finally the anchor pulled the chain tight, at which point it yanked Tom and Jackie towards the side of the boat. Alonzo would say when this happened, Jackie's head struck the inside of the side of the boat so hard it made this very loud, audible cracking sound. And then Skylar, Alonzo, and John just stood there as Tom and Jackie desperately tried to fight against the weight of this anchor that was trying to pull them off of the boat. Tom was trying to hold on to anything he could to try to hold his wife in place, but eventually the weight of this anchor combined with the movement of the boat was just too much. And so Tom and Jackie were very slowly pulled up and over and off the boat into the water. When they hit the water, they would have been fully alive, fully conscious, as they began their rapid descent to the bottom of the ocean, 3,500 feet below. Alonzo would tell police as soon as Tom and Jackie disappeared below the surface, Skylar let out a woohoo and ran over to the edge of the boat and looked into the water like a giddy child. And he was staring at where they had disappeared, and he was just grinning and laughing. And then finally, when the water went calm and there were no more bubbles, Skylar just kind of laughed, turned around, and made his way back to the cockpit and began piloting the boat back towards the dock. Even though Jennifer was not on the boat at the time of the murder, she was equally involved in it. In fact, the attack was her idea. She wanted more money, and she saw this scheme as being a way of doing that. So remember, when she showed up at the dock parking lot with her baby and put Jackie and Tom at ease to help get them out on that sea trial, she was doing that very intentionally to trap Jackie and Tom. She knew what was going to happen out on that boat. She was trying to get them to go so they could be murdered and they could steal their boat. And when Skylar was out on the boat, before, during, and after the murders, he would step aside and call Jennifer to let her know how it was going and kind of get her feedback and ask for advice about what they should do next. With that in mind, one of the darker elements of this case has to do with the video camera that was discovered inside of Jennifer and Skylar's house. It was the Hawks video camera, and they had used it over the past couple of years to document their travels out on the ocean. And so when the police acquired this video camera, they played the tape that was inside of it. And at first, the tape shows Jackie filming the inside of the well-deserved yacht, and she's talking about how sad it was that this is probably one of the last times they'll be inside of this boat. But she and Tom are so happy because they've found buyers who are going to take great care of this boat, and they're excited about the future. They're excited about their grandchild. And then suddenly, this footage of Jackie inside of the boat just totally cuts, and it jumps to Skylar and Jennifer at Thanksgiving dinner that year, playing with their daughter and just having this great time, meaning just days after Jennifer and Skylar murdered Tom and Jackie in the worst way imaginable, they took their camera and just began using it for their own lives, recording their own life over the memories of Tom and Jackie. Jennifer and Skylar truly didn't care at all about what they had just done. Alonzo would ultimately be sentenced to 20 years in prison. He would have gotten a much more severe sentence, but because he provided all of the details of what happened and he was promised a reduction in sentence, he was only given 20 years. Jennifer would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and John Kennedy and Skylar were sentenced to death. On the morning of February 2nd, 2012, a young man pulled off a 4-lane highway in Anchorage, Alaska, into a large, snowy parking lot. He passed by dozens of parked cars until he arrived in front of this small shack that was brightly teal-colored. It was a popular coffee shop called the Common Grounds, and this young man worked as a barista there. After he parked his car, he walked up to the white door employee entrance to this little building, and he got his key out and he went to unlock the door, but when he turned the key, he saw the door was already unlocked. He knew the girl who had worked the previous night and would have been responsible for locking the shop up. She was 18-year-old Samantha Koenig, and although she had only been on the job for about a month, she seemed very responsible and had never had any issues closing up before. The young man shrugged it off though. He figured people make mistakes, and he went inside. Right away, he noticed that a couple of things just seemed out of place. It was like Samantha must have just left in the middle of her shift without even attempting to clean up. There were napkins on the ground, there were towels out, there were cups still out. And so as this young man is walking over to the cash register to unlock it, he's running through scenarios in his head about how Samantha could have been so sloppy. And then he reached down with his register key, and just like the door, the cash register was already unlocked. When he pulled the tray out, all the money was gone. And that's when he knew they had been robbed. And so he called his boss. The night before, Samantha had asked her boyfriend, Dwayne, to pick her up after her shift at the Common Grounds. Dwayne arrived in front of the kiosk at about 8:30 p.m., which was 30 minutes after her shift should have been over. Dwayne had gotten held up at his job, which is why he was late. And so when he gets there, Dwayne looks around the parking lot and he doesn't see Samantha anywhere. He sees the coffee shop itself is totally dark and looks like it's been closed up for the night. And so Dwayne gets out of his truck into the freezing cold night air, and he walked up to the window of this coffee shop and he pressed his face up to the glass to look inside, but there was nobody in there. Dwayne automatically went back to the fight he had gotten into with Samantha earlier in the night via text message. She had accused him of cheating on her. He had been kind of nonchalant, like he didn't care about it, and what ensued was a really ugly fight. And so as Dwayne is walking back to his truck, he's thinking to himself, maybe Samantha just didn't want to see him because of the fight, and so at the end of her shift, she got a ride home from her father or maybe from a friend, and that's why she's not here. And so Dwayne gets back inside of his truck and he sends a text message to Samantha asking if she's okay, if she's gotten home. But after several minutes of no response from her, Dwayne, even though they were fighting, he still cares an awful lot about his girlfriend. He decides, I gotta go by her house and make sure she's there and that she's okay. And so a couple minutes later, he gets to her house, he goes up to the door, and her single father, James, answers the door. Dwayne explains that he didn't see Samantha after her shift and just wanted to make sure she was here. But James says, she's not here. I have no idea where she is. I haven't spoken to her. And so the two men go into James's kitchen, they sit down, and they start texting and calling Samantha to try to figure out where she is. And after a couple of minutes, Dwayne's phone lights up, and it's a text message from Samantha. And the message clearly indicates that she's still very upset with Dwayne, but she's saying that she needs some time to think and that she's going to be with some friends for a couple of days, and would he, Dwayne, let her father know where she was. And so Dwayne shows James the text message, and Samantha's father looks at it and he's thinking to himself, this is very uncharacteristic of Samantha. He had raised Samantha since she was 2 years old, and they were very close. They shared everything with each other. It didn't make any sense that she wouldn't contact him directly to say that she was going to be out with friends for a couple of days. And it didn't make sense that she would ignore all of his phone calls and text messages when clearly he was worried about her. The two men stayed up super late, calling and texting, hoping to get more information from Samantha, but she never responded. She never texted back. And so the following morning, when neither man had gotten any more messages from Samantha, James went to the Anchorage Police Department and filed a missing person report for his only daughter. After receiving this missing person report, an officer with the Anchorage Police Department called the owner of the Common Grounds coffee shop to ask about Samantha. And the owner actually said they just got a call from their barista that was working at the kiosk that morning, and they had informed them that apparently there had been a robbery and no one can get in touch with Samantha. No one knows where she is. The owner told the police officer that as soon as she got her hands on the security footage from the night before, she would send it over to the police department. While the police waited for this footage, some officers began calling Samantha's friends and other family members to see if they knew where she was, but no one had heard from her, no one knew where she was, no one had any information. Some other police officers headed over to the Common Grounds coffee kiosk to get a look at it for themselves. And when they got there was no sign of a struggle outside or inside the kiosk, and inside, underneath the counter, was a panic button that had not been pressed. And so even though Samantha's father thought there was something odd about her final text message, the police began operating under the theory that Samantha had robbed the kiosk and then left of her own accord. But what confounded police was how Samantha actually physically got away from the coffee shop. She didn't have a car that night, and she couldn't have just walked away because the weather was way too miserable and cold outside, and Anchorage is just not really a walkable city. And so if Samantha was telling the truth, that she was just taking a couple of days to be by herself with some friends at their place, then why didn't any of her friends know where she was? This question was answered later that day when the owner of the coffee shop made the security footage available. The footage, which has no audio, picks up around 8 p.m. on February 1st, 2012, which was the night Samantha went missing. It shows Samantha inside of the kiosk. She's working alone, she's cheerful, and she's busy. And then at some point, someone that we can't see, they're outside of the camera's range, comes up to the window and orders a drink. Samantha clearly turns to them, acknowledges their drink order, and turns and begins making this drink. And then after she's done making it, she turns to give it to this person, and immediately Samantha steps back and puts her arms up. And then seconds later, she reaches over and turns off the lights inside of the kiosk, and then she gets down on her knees with her back to the window. She stays in that position, not talking, not moving, for about a minute before she slowly stands up and walks down the kiosk towards the cash register. She opens it up, she scoops some money out of it, and then she walks back to the window and appears to hand it to a shadowy figure on the other side of the window, and then Samantha turns, kneels again with her back to the window. 2 more minutes go by before this person outside the window leans their entire upper body inside of the coffee shop. They reach down and they appear to tie Samantha's hands. Now, because it was dark inside of the kiosk, the footage winds up being extremely grainy, and there's no way to identify who this figure is. Although it's fairly obvious that it's a male. He's wearing a big sweatshirt and he's got a hat pulled down low over his face. After this mystery man is done tying Samantha's hands, he leaps through the window and then shuts the window behind him. And then he stands Samantha up, he puts a gun into her back, and then he marches her out the employee door and then out across the lot, all the way to a white pickup truck where he puts her inside and they drive off. Over the next couple of days, the police and also the FBI, who had been called in to be a part of this investigation, they just kept hitting dead end after dead end because there was no evidence. All they had was this surveillance footage that was too grainy to tell who this guy was that took Samantha. Meanwhile, Samantha's father, James, had rallied the support of nearly all 300,000 people that lived in Anchorage to go out and look for his daughter. His efforts were so profound, it had attracted major news outlets across the country, and suddenly his daughter's story had grabbed national headlines everywhere. This led to strangers donating thousands of dollars to fund a reward for anybody that had information about Samantha's whereabouts. But despite this reward growing in size every single day, and the national news media becoming increasingly more interested in this case, no one came forward with useful information that led to developments in this case, and Samantha never got in touch with Dwayne or her father. Then on February 24th, so 3 weeks after Samantha's gone missing and no one's heard from her, Dwayne got a text message from Samantha's phone, and it was directing him to a particular sign inside of a nearby public park. And so Dwayne and James read this text, they shared it with the police department, and then they raced to this park and actually beat the police there by about 15 minutes. And so Dwayne and James, they walk through the gates and they start walking down this main trail, and they stop in front of this sign. It was actually a bulletin board, and tacked on the bulletin board was a Ziploc bag, inside of which was a typed ransom note. And on the ransom note, literally Xeroxed onto it, was a black and white photo of Samantha. And in this photo, Samantha looks kind of dazed, like she's got a blank expression, and she's not really looking at the camera. She's looking just to the side of the camera. And then in this picture, a man is holding a copy of the Anchorage Daily News newspaper that's dated February 13th, 2012. This was a proof of life photo where Samantha's captor was holding up that newspaper to indicate that Samantha was alive as of February 13th. And so to everybody involved in this case, including Samantha's father, even though this is still not a good situation at all, it was kind of a relief to know that at least as of last week, Samantha was alive. As for the demands of this ransom note, James was told to deposit $30,000 into his daughter's account immediately, and if he did that, she would be released 6 months later. As advised by the FBI, James deposited a portion of the ransom money into his daughter's account, and then the FBI just waited and watched, because they knew if anyone tried to withdraw money from that account, they could track where the card was. A few days later, 3 separate withdrawals were made within Anchorage, but each time the FBI got a notification about one of these withdrawals, they would rush to the scene, and whoever it was that had tried to make this withdrawal was long gone. When they pulled the security footage from these 3 different ATMs, the person that was making these withdrawals was a man wearing a ski mask and big sunglasses, so they had no way to identify him. After these withdrawals, the account went silent for over a week, and in that time, there was no word from Samantha. Then on March 7th, more withdrawals were made, but they were in Arizona, and then New Mexico, and then in Texas. Again, authorities would rush to these ATMs, but they would get there right after the masked man with sunglasses had just left. But there was a break this time. In one of these surveillance videos from one of the Texas ATMs, they spotted the car this guy was getting into before he left. And it was a small sedan, it was a white Ford Focus, and they saw him leave going east on a Texas highway. And so authorities in Texas were told to look out for this particular car in this part of Texas. And sure enough, on March 13th, a Texas patrolman spotted the car sitting in a hotel parking lot. He waited nearby until a man in his 30s walked out of one of the hotel rooms, walked down and got inside the car, and then this patrolman just kind of followed him and looked for any reason to pull him over. And as he had his radar gun on this guy, he noticed he was going 2 miles per hour above the speed limit, and so he pulled him over. The patrolman got out, he walked up to the driver's side window, the window was already down, the man was very calm. The patrolman asked him for his license, and the guy handed him an Alaskan license. His name was Israel Keys, he was 34 years old, and he lived in Anchorage. The patrolman knew this was the guy. He called in backup, and before long they were searching Keys' car, and in the trunk they found a ski mask along with other clothes that matched the description of the guy who was making withdrawals from these different ATMs. They also found a gun, as well as Samantha's cell phone and debit card. After Keys was arrested and was brought into custody, he denied having any involvement with Samantha's disappearance. But after being presented with the overwhelming evidence that suggested otherwise, he caved and said yes, he would tell them the full story of what happened to Samantha, but they had to get him an Americano coffee, a peanut butter Snickers, and a cigar. Once he had said items, he began to speak. And what he said was so disturbing and so graphic, the FBI still has not released the full transcript of his confession. Here is the version of events based on what was made public. On February 1st, 2012, Keys decided he was going to rob the Common Grounds coffee kiosk. He walked up to the window expecting there to be some teenager working inside, and he was right. It was Samantha. He asked her for an Americano, and while she turned to make his drink, suddenly his plan changed. Not only was he going to steal money from inside of this coffee shop, he decided he was going to steal Samantha from this coffee shop. When she turned back with his drink and handed it to him, he discreetly pulled his gun out and aimed it at her and told her this was a robbery. That's when she backed up and put her hands up, and then she turned around, he tied her hands, he jumped back inside, and then he said after he shut the window, he jammed napkins inside of her mouth so she couldn't make any sound, and then he marched her out the door, outside, into his car, and they took off. Once they were in the vehicle, he pulled the napkins out of her mouth mouth, and he told her if she tried to escape or if she tried to flag anybody down that he would just kill her. And so he said she was very obedient. She was obviously very scared, but she was trying to do her best to stay composed. At some point, Keyes reached over and took her phone and sent that text message to her boyfriend informing him that she was going to be spending a couple of days with friends and that he should tell her father. And then Keyes told Samantha he was going to be holding her hostage and trying to extract some ransom money. Samantha told Keyes that her family was very poor and that he wouldn't get much money out of them. To which Keyes said, "Don't worry about it. I know they'll raise money and they'll come up with it somehow." Then they drove around Anchorage for several hours, periodically stopping so Samantha could get out and relieve herself, other times so Keyes could smoke a cigar. Then around midnight, Keyes made his way back to his house and he pulled into the driveway and he turned to Samantha and he had her go in the back seat and lie down, and he put some tarps over her and he told her if she tried to escape, he would kill her. And then Keyes got out and he walked inside of his house where his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were fast asleep. And in just a few hours, Keyes and his daughter were scheduled to go to New Orleans for a 2-week-long luxury cruise. Keyes left his house and went back to his car. He put a blindfold on Samantha and then led her down the driveway to his shed. Once inside, he sat her down on an upturned bucket in the back of the shed, and then he put a rope around her neck and he anchored each end of the rope to the wall so she was pinned to the wall. Then Keyes turned his radio all the way up to make sure it masked any noise she might make, even though he reminded her repeatedly that if she made any noise, he would just kill her, and by and large, she was very obedient. And then he gave her a couple of cigarettes to smoke and told her it was going to be just fine, to just chill out, that he was going to get the ransom money from their family, and then as soon as that was done, he would let her go. He turned on some space heaters to keep the space warm, and then he left and locked the door. He walked back into his house and double-checked that his daughter and his girlfriend were still asleep. They were. Afterwards, he started drinking some wine and relaxing, and then after a little while, he got a cup of water and he went back out to the shed. He went inside and he gave the water to Samantha, and he said Samantha was very composed. She was obviously frightened, but she asked him, "Did you speak to my father? Did you figure out the ransom situation?" And Keyes told her that, "Yes, I talked to your father. Everything's working out fine. He's going to raise the money. We're going to get you out of here. Everything's going exactly to plan." After that, he walked up to Samantha and he unscrewed the 2 anchors that were holding that rope up against her throat, and then he cut the zip ties on her wrist, allowing her to relax and sit forward and just kind of be at ease for a second. And it was very obvious that Samantha was relieved. Her nightmare was about to be over. But then seconds later, Keyes grabbed her really aggressively and tied her up all over again, this time much more thoroughly and much more tightly. It had been a cruel trick. When he cut her handcuffs and undid her necktie, he just wanted to see what she would do if she thought she was being let go. When in reality, he was never going to let her go. There was no ransom. He had not spoken to her father. It was all a big lie. Keyes told investigators that as he was tying her up for that second time, he looked at her face and she had this look of total resignation. He said she knew what was about to happen to her. After Keyes tied her up, he left the shed and locked it behind him. He went inside to check one more time to make sure his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were still asleep. When they were, he went back to the shed, he opened it up, he went inside, and this time when he stepped inside, it smelled like urine and sweat, and he looked down at Samantha and she was terrified. He walked up to her and he began to assault her, and then after he was done, he was standing over her getting his clothes back on, and Samantha very stoically looks up at him and says, "Are you going to kill me?" And he says, "Yes, I am." As he put on his leather gloves, she tried to talk him out of it, but he said there was no other way. Keyes would tell investigators that he was very impressed with Samantha's bravery. Shortly before 4 a.m., Keyes drove a knife into Samantha's back before choking her until she stopped moving. He told investigators that she never made a sound. After she was dead, Keyes left the shed and locked it behind him. He went into his house, he took a shower. Afterwards, he woke up his daughter and told her to start getting ready because they were leaving soon for the airport. While his daughter was getting ready, Keyes went back out to the shed, he went inside, he rolled Samantha's body up in a tarp and pushed her towards the back. He unplugged the space heaters, turned off the lights, turned off the music, and then double locked the shed and went back inside the house to make his daughter breakfast. At 5 a.m., a cab showed up at the house and Keyes and his daughter hopped inside and they made their way to the airport and then on to New Orleans, where they went on their 2-week-long vacation. After they got back, Keyes went inside of his shed, he unrolled Samantha from her tarp, and by his account, she still looked fairly lively, and so he dressed her in some new clothes, he put lots of makeup on her face, he braided her hair, and then he stitched her eyelids open so it gave the impression she was alive and alert, and then he held up a copy of the Anchorage Daily News next to her, and then took several photos, creating that proof of life photo for the ransom note. If you want to see this photo, you can Google it, but not, that's up to you. After he took these pictures, he chopped her body up into pieces and then disposed of her in a nearby frozen lake. It would turn out Samantha was not Israel Keys' first victim. He was in fact a serial killer who specifically preyed on completely random people because he enjoyed watching them die. Over the years, he had hid what he called kill kits all over the United States, which were these caches filled with weapons and other tools designed to capture and kill people. This way, no matter where he was in the country, when he had an urge to go kill someone, he would just go to his nearest kill kit, dig it up, and then go target a random stranger. And he didn't care if you were young, old, big, small, male, female, alone, or in a group. Everyone was a target of opportunity. Keys told investigators that as soon as he saw Samantha inside of that coffee kiosk, instantly he knew he was going to kill her. Everything about the ransom, the robbery, all of it was just a lie to keep her in line, to give her some hope that she might get out of this alive. When in reality, the second she walked outside of the doors of that kiosk, she was dead. Keys admitted to killing Samantha as well as an older couple up in Vermont, but he would take his own life in a jail cell in December of 2012 before he named any of his other victims. And so to this day, we have no idea how many people he killed. The best guess is 11 based on a drawing he made in his jail cell.